everyone. My name is Sam. As you just heard, I head up the TTIP work, or the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership work at Friends of the Earth. I've been heading it up for about a year and a half now. If you don't know about Friends of the Earth, we're the largest environmental grassroots network in the world. We're in about 70 odd countries and have maybe about 5,000 local groups around the world as well. And I was actually specifically asked to talk about TTIP and democracy. I'm not sure how much you actually want me to explain what TTIP is first now, because as I'm going first, but I'm going to do that briefly. It's a trade agreement being negotiated between the EU and US. It would be the biggest bilateral trade agreement of all time, encompassing about 50% of world trade, and people have lots of concerns about it, including effects on food safety, health. Some people have concerns about public services, but one of the overriding fears is that it will have some sort of impact on our democracy, or it will undermine the ability of our governments to legislate in our best interest. And in talking about this, I suppose it's good to qualify that nearly all international agreements constrain the ability of national governments in some way or other. For example, climate agreements, ILO conventions on labour. The difference when it comes to trade agreements, for the most part, when compared to those, is that they have teeth. So, for example, when we look at the WTO, where the focus has historically been on tariffs and ensuring tariffs are punitive taxes on imports, essentially designed to protect local business against foreign. So when you look at tariffs and also non-discrimination, so that local government doesn't treat foreign companies differently, the WTO can go to a dispute. If the US, for example, went to the WTO and said that there was a problem here, it could lead to large fines being dished out to the local government who's discriminated against foreign businesses, and it can result in fines. And this has been the way of the world for a while. The difference with TTIP and where it expands on the WTO and previous trade agreements in the past is that it goes a lot further. It goes behind the border. So instead of looking at tariffs, which has been the traditional focus of trade agreements, it looks at non-tariff barriers. I apologise for the use of the terminology involved. Non-tariff barriers can be understood as regulation that is an irritant to trade. And for example, one example of that could be the fact that in the US, 11 chemicals in cosmetics are banned from use. In the EU, about 1,300 are. Therefore, the US cosmetic companies can't export a huge amount of their product to the EU. That's a regulatory trade barrier. That's an extreme one. It could also be that regulators in the EU require seatbelts to be tested again, even though they've already been tested in the US. So you have a range in terms of the scope. And the thing about TTIP is that 50% of these tariff barriers, or the actual ones, are meant to be removed, and that's meant to encompass 80% of the benefits we're going to have from TTIP in the future, or the predicted benefits. And how will that be done? Well, at the big level, it would be through a harmonisation of regulation. So that would be one way of doing it, to have regulation the same here and the same as in the US. That's probably not going to happen. We regulate quite differently, so it'd be through mutual recognition, where we recognise their regulatory process as equivalent to ours in terms of the outcomes. And in doing so, their companies can export to the EU cost-free. So, but this in itself brings about a problem, because if we're looking at regulation, it becomes the question, what is regulation for? What is the purpose of it? Is it solely an irritant to trade? Is it solely an irritant to economic activity? Or is it something that has intrinsic benefit in and of its own right? And to quote Harvard economist Danny Roderick, I'm going to read this because he says it better than I would. In the TTIP, the reduction of so-called non-tariff barriers to trade between the US and EU will almost certainly restrict the space for domestic regulatory action. Even if regulatory harmonisation does not create a race to the bottom, the interests of investors and exporters will cast a longer shadow than before over social and environmental goals. And TTIP is not just about removing existing regulatory barriers to trade. It's meant to be a living agreement. It's meant to be a process. So the idea is that it was also about ensuring that regulatory barriers are not constructed in the future. And we've already seen in the EU TTIP's impacts to this regard. So I'm going to give 3 examples. In 2013, at the beginning of the negotiations, just as they're about to start, the EU approved the lactic acid wash of beef. So of beef carcass after slaughter. That sounds like quite a boring thing, but it's actually been a sticking point in the EU for quite a long time, and that was largely seen as a show of good faith to the Americans, because all of a sudden they could export things to the EU that they couldn't before. We've also seen a weakening of climate legislation to do with the Fuel Quality Directive, which was to ensure that transport fuels have lower emissions. That was weakened so as not to discriminate against Canadian tar sands coming through the US, and that was largely considered to be a concession to US trade negotiators who put a lot of pressure on the Commission, saying that this would undermine the TTIP negotiation. We've also seen it on the scrapping of certain endocrine disrupting chemicals in pesticides. There's a scrapping of legislation under pressure from USTR because they said it would undermine TTIP negotiations. So the big question is, for me, is what is regulation for? What is its overriding prerogative? At a time of environmental collapse, are we creating an international system that encourages and facilitates needed government and regulatory action, or are we creating one that treats regulation solely as an irritant to trade and economic prosperity and something that needs mitigation? And don't forget the teeth. I mentioned trade agreements have teeth. It has a mechanism, a legal mechanism called ISDS, which essentially allows foreign corporations to take a government to an international arbitration tribunal and sue them for a lot of money if they bring forward a public policy action that the company deems to affect its ability to make a profit either now or in the future. And this is very expensive, and it can have a chilling effect. So, for example, the average legal costs is about $8 million. The largest award under these mechanisms, which do exist elsewhere, has been $50 billion. And we see the chilling effect because Philip Morris, one example is Philip Morris International is suing Australia for an undisclosed amount using one of these clauses in a trade agreement that Australia has with Hong Kong. And we don't know how much they're suing them for, but we do know that the legal costs on the Australian side have already totted up to $50 million. The New Zealand Health Minister has come out and said we will not pass similar legislation to bring in plain packaged cigarettes until we find out the result of this case, because it's very expensive. It could prove very expensive. Currently, there are some of these agreements between EU member states and the US, but only 8% of them contain ISDS. If TTIP was to come through, 100% of them would. And I'm about to conclude with my last minute. So what we're left with is a question of values and priorities. So if we were to accept that in an international world there will always be some constraints on national government action, we have to ask whether the main problem is that we as a global society, the main problem that we as a global society are facing, is it that investors and exporters do not have enough influence over our rules? Is it that they are being bogged down by government legislation? And if that's the case, then maybe TTIP's the answer. But if, and this is what I believe, if the overriding priority is that we need to address action, we need to have action on climate change, we need stronger environmental legislation, we need to be able to regulate dangerous toxins, as I assume that actually some of these corporations that have really damaged parts of our planet already have too much influence over the way the government acts, then I'd say that TTIP is more curse than saviour. And I'd probably leave you with that question: what is it do you value? And the next question after that, is TTIP going to help address that? My answer personally is no. Yours might be different.